so tired, carry me. I swear, if Rana Renatha hadn't asked me to accompany you, I would have left you for the undead. You wouldn't have done that, would you? Is that a trick question? The barge sent from Eastwatch to Rolengork's southern shore bumped into the pier. It was the first of many, as continued scrying discovered tens of thousands of beastmen fleeing in their direction. The passengers disembarked, and the warrior carrying KHHSCHLR shifted the guru's weight before joining the others. Everyone looked supremely miserable and thoroughly soaked. Thurgakral breathed. The warrior's ears swiveled in their direction and she raised her head to look toward them. Her tired eyes widened in disbelief. A loud thump punctuated the air as KHHSCHLR was dumped onto the pier. Thurgak ran forward. The girl flung herself bodily at Rol, knocking him over. Endearing chuffs filled the air and a break appeared in the clouds, allowing a beam of sunlight to shine upon the couple. Overhead, a rainbow formed. Wow, Mitra pressed her paws together in delight. It's like a production from the Isles of Mumba. I don't hear any music, Jirika said. And isn't it supposed to be the guy that dumps the villainess for the heroine? Kasturi added. I'm lost. Rana Saj's eyes followed each speaker. Is the Beastman Confederacy so advanced that it can predict these events? Don't worry about it, Saraka said. What's important is that we should have a clearer picture of events in the south with this. They returned to the hold, where the assembled lords were awaiting their return. Several were still watching Karavaki's team of sacred fists as they continued their scrying of the countryside. Rana Saj said, I know you're tired, but you've witnessed this entire debacle from its beginning. I understand, Thurgak replied. Food and refreshments were brought before her and the lords patiently waited as she settled down. First of all, Rana Saj, what happened with Clan Torika's defense of their hold? They gathered 100,000 warriors by the time the undead arrived, Thurgak said. I was with Rana Renatha in the Western Army. Rana Kimb was leading the south. The undead exposed themselves to attack when they moved to encircle the city, and Rana Kimb was sent to destroy the encircling forces while Rana Renatha held the main body of the undead in check. The lords around the table nodded at her account. Conventionally, it was the proper response for that situation. Saraka, however, felt that something was off. What made Rana Renatha think that he could hold the main body of the undead forces in check? Because we were strong enough to do it? We were able to hold them at the original defense line for 2 weeks by using warbands to skirmish down their numbers. Except that shouldn't have been the case. Elder Liches generally didn't view enemies impeding their progress as obstacles, they saw them as offenders. They shouldn't have cared about potential losses, they should have attempted to crush the offenders with extreme prejudice. Continue your account, Saraka said. I thought we were doing well. Rana Renatha sent warbands to skirmish with the undead and we must have destroyed thousands of them without taking any losses of our own. But, then, a fog bank appeared to conceal the undead. The people coming in from Rana Vere's side reported something similar, Rana Kjura said. To nullify our skirmishers, they use a bank of fog to cover their forces. As it moves forward, so, too, do the undead. Anyone that gets caught in it is never seen from again. Did it count as a strange tactic for the undead to use? Kroll mentioned that the Katsa Plains was covered in impenetrable fog, so the local undead may have just brought their home conditions with them out of familiarity with its advantages rather than it being a result of active tactical development. Rana Renatha pulled his forces back from the fog just in case it was some sort of trap, Thurgak said. But then undead came out of the Rolengork and entered the city through its port. We went to save the civilians in the city and Rana Renatha ordered them evacuated. He told me to accompany KHHSCHLR. After that, it was chaos. So neither Rana Renatha nor Rana Kimp survived? I don't know, Thurgak replied. We just ran. The bridge across the river was blocked by the undead, so we had to go south to find a way across. There were some boats in the first hold along the way so we used those to cross, then they got sunk. Something just tore open the bottoms and we had to swim the rest of the way. Not everyone made it. After that, we went east, warning everyone we could. The lords discussed her account between themselves in low voices. Saraka crossed his arms and brooded in silence. Something definitely wasn't right. What about the clans in the southern mountains? One of the lords asked. They were called for, Thurgak answered, but they didn't arrive. The south is pretty big, plus it was the start of the monsoon. There just wasn't enough time. Maybe they'll come east and head this way after learning of Toraka, the Lord said. That's not something we can count on, said another. She's right. With how quickly events are occurring, those southern clans will be too late. Conditions are simply against them. Let's go back to the beginning of all this, Soraka said. When did the powerful undead start to appear? The Elder Liches and Death Knights. Death Knights? The armored ones with the tower shields. They were there from the beginning, Thurgok said. Goro said that Elder Liches control armies of lesser undead, so all the mindless undead coming out to attack Clan Kisha all nice and organized meant that they were probably around somewhere controlling them. The Death Knights first appeared to flank us in that same battle. They weren't just the ones with the shields, though. Soraka narrowed his eyes. They flanked you? On purpose? Not because they just happened to notice you on the way to wherever they were headed. It seemed like it. Clan Kisha chose to defend the top of a valley, but the undead drew them in. Goro sensed a trap and sent me to evacuate the children and their caregivers, and then the Death Knights came straight down the defiles that Clan Kisha was supposed to be defending. They've been played. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, and then released a long sigh. The undead have been playing us all for fools, Soraka said. What do you mean? Ranasaj asked. Thurgok, Soraka said. How many people from Clan Kisha survived? 2. Goro sent a roll to warn the clans before the battle. He sent me away just in time to help Clan Kisha retreat, but none of Clan Kisha survived to reach the warrior clan's territories. There were the warriors that were with me, but we parted ways early on and I haven't seen them since. Because no one was meant to survive that battle, Soraka said. Having a whole clan in full retreat was undesirable. Was it like that for the other clans, as well? I think so, yes. The undead fell upon everyone with barely any warning. Only a few people in the easternmost areas made it to safety, such that it was panic everywhere they reached, people fleeing and being slowly overrun. Suffering and death stretched out to their maximum extent. He had never seen or heard of the like. Even the undead-infested Dreadlands had never produced such a purpose-driven undead army. In bits and pieces, the behavior appeared characteristic, but, as a whole, this may have seemed like an undead horde to you, Soraka told the assembled lords, but everything about this has been meticulously planned. From start to finish. There is something terrible behind these undead. I know, Thurgok replied softly. You do? Thurgok blinked as if she had been unaware that she had responded. I do. Anyone that has been out there for long enough can feel it. The hunter. The hunter? What do you mean by that? There's no other way to describe it, Thurgok said. It's like you're being stalked. Every rock, tree and bush becomes suspicious, every shadow and patch of tall grass. You catch yourself looking over your shoulder all the time. A constant presence just presses down on you, wringing you out like an old rag. At first, it's unnerving, but it can last for weeks. When you run, it feels like you're being chased. When you're finally too tired to go any further, you keep getting startled out of your sleep until oblivion takes you. As she spoke, her claws drew long furrows in the stone table. Her whole body trembled, and a haunted look glossed her eyes over. I've heard this before, Ranakjara said. The people coming in from Ranavere's northern forces were saying similar things. They were being pursued, so I figured that they were simply hysterical between what they had experienced and their exhausted state. What did it mean? It was true that, as an undead being grew more powerful, they could become unique in behavior and form. But, as far as he knew, they still stayed within the bounds of what was expected of the undead. The hunter, an undead ranger? A death ranger? A being that employs the undead the same way a beastmaster might employ magical beasts. A hunter of the living. Mitra, does any of this make sense to you? An undead hunter? Well, you could say that many undead naturally prey on the living, which sort of makes them hunters. A vampire lord that didn't go the social route, maybe? Or some kind of super-evolved ghast? Whatever it was, they had to get rid of it. It wasn't just some vampire or ghast preying on one thing at a time, it was a being that used the undead as an engine to propagate negative energy on a countrywide scale. Furthermore, it had somehow attracted many powerful, intelligent undead of different species to its cause. The very thought of the hunter unnerved him, but not in the same way as it did Thurgood. It was potentially a true lord of the undead, a being that could unify the enemies of all life and turn the entire world into a negative energy hellscape if allowed to exist. Something poked him in the arm. He looked to his left to find Kasturi holding a paper scroll. "This is what it looks like so far," she said. He unfurled the scroll, furrowing his brow at the details. They were close. "Is there a map of this region available?" Soraka asked. Ranakjura nodded at one of his attendants, who brought in a rolled-up nug hide and rolled it out across the table. Soraka placed Kasturi's map atop it, trying to match the limited features included in the scried area with those on the hide map. The lords around the table stood to see what he was doing. "I'm going to have to get our mystics to learn that spell," Rana Saj said. "Using that spell on its own is dangerous," Soraka said. "They'll have to learn the appropriate protections and countermeasures as well. Actually, I'm surprised you didn't already know it. Most tribal societies have specialized diviners amongst their mystics. Then again, it was a fourth-tier spell, so maybe it wasn't so easy to access." A minute later, Soraka finished laying out an array of tokens marking the undead positions on the south side of the river. They were a day away, meaning that the forces that the lords presumed were behind had already caught up with their northern counterparts. "At this rate," Soraka said, "it would be better for them to come to us while we set up proper defensive lines." "I agree," Rana Saj said, though reluctantly. "Doing so leaves the entire border in the south vulnerable, but it's still better to concentrate our forces where they currently are. We don't have time to do anything else. We can send runners back upriver right now and have the clans on that side prepare their defenses," Ranakjura suggested. The lords around the table nodded in agreement. Kasturi appeared at his arm again. "Karavaki wanted you to know about something odd," she said. "The humans are being left behind in their towns and villages." "That doesn't make any sense," Soraka swept his gaze across the table. "Even if you only see humans as prey, every living being left behind for the undead will make our enemies stronger." "It was too difficult to move that many," one of the lords replied. "Too difficult?" Soraka flicked his ear. "Humans have legs. They can travel farther in a day than the average bar, Sing or Osalo, might I add. That's a question best answered by Guru Khshschlr." Soraka looked around. "Where is she?" he asked. "Probably where I left her," Thurgood answered with a shrug. He nodded to a couple of his warriors, who left the hall to retrieve the guru. They took the opportunity to have a short break, and Soraka went over to see what Karavaki was doing. "There weren't as many undead on the southern side as I thought there would be," Karavaki said as she moved her scrying sensor around. "Rana Renatha may have been defeated," Soraka said, "but the number of warriors they had could still destroy millions of undead in the process. Did you identify anything aside from what's been mentioned so far?" "A few. No soul eaters, thankfully. Occasionally, there's one that's equipped like a Minotaur hero, but the weapons are more archaic looking. More worrisome are the ones that look like priests. It's going to complicate things if they have healers." As far as he knew, the last time any substantial number of undead healers had been involved in a pitched battle was 300 years ago when the Khalifa of Dar al-Hariq raised the necropolis of Mu'at so hard that it became a permanently smoldering crater. It wasn't the sort of history that anyone wanted to ever experience in person. "What about the Elder Liches? Anything that might be a Night Lich?" "They're hard to spot at all since they like to fly above the field of view of our sensors. Now that you mention it, though, there's something strange about these undead overall. They all have that fresh look. As if they just spawned. All of their equipment seems identical. Most powerful undead that have been around for a while make the effort to upgrade." "I can't say that there's any easy way for Death Knights to find upgrades," Soraka said, "but you have a point if it's the Elder Liches. What they spawn with isn't so great." Puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. It was interesting in its own way, but they didn't have the luxury to study all of the mysteries presenting themselves. "Will you be ordering long-range bombardment?" Karavaki asked. "If so, I can begin our preparations." "Given the nature of our opponent," Soraka answered, "that's probably unwise. Unless we can guarantee that we can end whatever is behind this, it's better not to give them any ideas. They could already start hitting the undead with ritual magic from Eastwatch, but even the awareness that something was possible was dangerous. The last thing they needed was an undead army filled with Elder Liches developing war magic." Something more conventional, then, Karaaki said. Magical traps and the like. Forbiddance would work wonders, Soraka admitted, but it's dangerous to our side, too. We don't have the time to sort people out by their karma. We can use it for ourselves, though. Also, since we're facing the undead, Hallow is guaranteed to be useful. Throw in some druidic field effects, as well. I'll make the arrangements once you figure out our positioning. Positioning, huh? The terrain of the Draconic Kingdom was far from ideal for beastmen of their type. Then again, the weather made for challenging conditions for everyone involved aside from well-trained rangers. All this rain and mud should cut their mobility in half, then field effects like entangle and spike growth will cut it in half again. Spike growth should destroy any weak undead attempting to get through. Did Roland Gork's mystics use the same spells? They were first and third tier spells, respectively, but the highly mobile form of warfare that Roland Gork's warbands specialized in may have not seen their tactical adoption. If there's anything the local mystics already have access to, Soraka said, feel free to advise them on their defensive applications in this situation. How long should we continue scrying for? Until we have a decent feel for the front. We don't have the time or mana to do any more than that. It shouldn't be long until we start figuring out our placements and you can start deploying field defenses. Soraka returned to the table, taking a few bites of the food that had been laid out for the assembly. Rana Saj gave him a sidelong glance. You seem well accustomed to this sort of thing, he said. There isn't a shred of hesitation in any of your decisions, despite being a guest. I apologize if I seem presumptuous, Soraka said, but the undead are a problem for everyone. Also, being well accustomed to war at this scale may seem wholly respectable to you, but it isn't something to be mindlessly proud of for us. With sufficient advancement, what is right and honorable for your people can become terrifying and to be avoided if at all possible. War is generally the last recourse between civilized nations, though I feel that it is a recourse all too often arrived at in spite of everything. I lack your perspective, Rana Saj said, but you may be right about that. Never once have I considered my earnest actions in the wrong. We always witness firsthand the immediate cause and effect of everything we do. I can't imagine what it's like for you. In a way, Soraka envied the peoples of the uncivilized fringes of the world. A tribe had its champions in various fields, and those champions remained close to the roots of their respective causes. As civilization advanced, things became increasingly complex and detached. One could find themselves fighting for something they would otherwise be adamantly against if they had any clue about what was going on. Guru Khshschlr entered the room, hanging over the shoulder of one of Soraka's bodyguards. The clan lords around the room were clearly less than impressed by her entrance. Gurus, commonly known as sages elsewhere, were not in themselves a vocation that lent to high degrees of physical growth. Most sages were found in civilian fields, and Khshschlr was no stronger than the average civilian beastman. As she was dumped onto a chair before the assembled lords, Soraka could only think that any member of the faceless multitude left behind to be consumed by the undead deserved to be carried to safety more than Khshschlr. Well, she panted. This is a surprise, but we thank you for coming so far to see us. Spare us any pretense of authority, Khshschlr, Rana Saj rumbled. We came at the behest of Rana Renatha, not you. There are, however, a great many questions that the lords of Roland Gork have about Clan Torika's conduct. Our conduct? The Guru blinked. Why did you deceive us about the War Master's demise? Silence followed Rana Saj's pointed question. The nearby braziers cast flickering shadows over the shifting expression on Khshschlr's face. Because there was no need to undermine the confidence of the people, she said. Everything was under control. Under control? Rana Kshra scoffed. I have had time enough with the local lords to understand that state of control. Hundreds of thousands of migrants sent to the western fringes to face starvation while you monopolized trade in the east. Humans raiding and slaughtering civilians in the southern ranges, leaving their arrow-ridden corpses to rot in the sun. An invasion planned for the lands across the sea, where gods know what awaits those you send. This is not what Ranadratha proposed to us before embarking on his great venture. You have sucked everyone around you into this ever-growing vortex of lies. This conquest was supposed to be long concluded, Rana Saj said. Ranadratha promised all of us our western gateway. One that would lead us to the future. What happened to establishing peace with the Draconic Kingdom? Soraka's head snapped over to regard Ranasage in shock. This is the first I've heard of this, Soraka said. How has anything that's been done in the Draconic Kingdom counted as a step toward peace? Peace is what comes after conquest, yes? Ranasage replied. After proving our supremacy beyond the shadow of a doubt, Ranadratha was supposed to force terms upon the Draconic Kingdom. They were to become a tributary of our confederation. Ranadratha was very clear about this point, Ranakjara said. The humans have much that we do not. Technology, magic, resources and connections to the wider world. It would be a colossal waste to destroy them, and we do not yet possess the means to accomplish what they do. Have you tried asking? We have. Many times. Every time our raids were decisively beaten back and their warriors earned a measure of our respect, we made diplomatic overtures as equals. Unfortunately, all such overtures have ended at the end of the Angel's shining blade, so Ranadratha proposed that we needed to utterly crush their will to fight. Thus, conquest. The logic was sound, from their perspective. Without something that all parties respected, genuine diplomacy couldn't happen. With any race that would otherwise dominate the land without the existence of other races, that usually meant enough de facto power to dissuade others from seeing violence as the easiest way to achieve their ends. Violent conflict was just as often a precursor to conventional diplomacy as it was the result of failed diplomacy, especially since some races were better at empty posturing than others. One war was all it took to destroy any such facade, and falling for that same facade could cause irreparable harm. A weak neighbor was an unreliable neighbor, after all. There can be no peace with the humans, KHHSCHLR spat. They only want to see us destroyed. You describe their actions in the mildest of ways. The Western clans know the full truth of things. Furthermore, we will never forgive them for killing our beloved Warmaster. Is that why you turned them into livestock? Soraka asked, in retaliation for your loss. What's wrong with treating food as food? The Guru answered. And that's why you've also left them as fodder for the undead? How foolish can you be? What are you talking about? The humans were left behind for the undead because they were too difficult to move. Is that your doing? I said no such thing to anyone. Still, the Lord who had first mentioned the issue said, that was the result. You claimed that it would make the humans more docile. That was indeed the case, but it also made them incapable of caring for themselves. In your own words, one of the best points of ranching humans was that they were low maintenance. Now, they have become a liability. Soraka's ears swiveled from KHHSCHLR to the Lord, then back again. What did you do? Soraka said in a low voice as he rose from his seat. What did I do? I made them happy. I admit that it affected their efficiency, but we've been working on refining things. What did you do? We distributed a plant. There was this place in Stormport where the humans seemed quite pleased with life in general. I asked the proprietor about them and he left me with a list of them. Some of them were more than plentiful along our southern border. The one we used was Lera, I believe. KHHSCHLR tumbled back in her chair onto the floor as Soraka pounced over the table. He snatched her by the throat and slammed her into the beams of the ceiling. You fiend! Is there no end to your evil? Did Lord Yama's servants somehow miss you before you re-entered this temporal coil? Hua KHHSCHLR gasped. Why are you so angry? They're people, Soraka roared up at her. Acting out one's roles in life is one thing, ruining them is another. A fool with the means and will to act out their idiocy was the most dangerous person of all. How much damage had she caused with the careless implementation of her ideas? How many generations would pay the price for her folly? Soraka considered doing Roland Gork a favor and ending her right then and there. I believe it's time for you to leave, KHHSCHLR, Ranasage said from behind him. The floorboards shuddered as KHHSCHLR was released. Soraka stalked back to his seat. Leave? KHHSCHLR coughed, rubbing her throat. How can you say that? I've dedicated my entire life to the conquest of the Draconic Kingdom. To our people. After all that I've done. You've already done more than enough, Ranasage said. That aside, civilians not playing a role in logistical support have been commanded to withdraw from the front. You are no exception, KHHSCHLR. KHHSCHLR turned a pleading gaze at the assembled clan lords, but even those under Clan Torika looked away. She seemed to shrink as the moments passed, finally slinking out of the hall without another word. "There isn't much we can do about the humans," Ranakjara said. "We can hardly send out our forces to retrieve them with the undead nearly upon us." "I don't suppose you have any convenient solution for this, Soraka?" Ranasaj asked. Soraka shook his head. "No. This sort of problem requires an institutional effort. It's not so simple that it can be solved by a single person casting a spell. In that case, we'll simply have to shoulder the burdens of KHHSCHLR's unwanted efforts. Let's get back to planning our defense. By the way, what are the chances that the humans swept up in this have survived?" He crossed his arms, sighing as his eyes traced over the markers on the map representing countless undead. "None," Soraka said. "A shame," Ranasaj said. "The undead have exacted a tragic toll on everyone. Despite everything that has happened, Ranadratha's original proposal still holds as much merit now as it did back then. I was hoping to salvage what we could in the aftermath." "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Looking worried. If you look worried, how do you think that makes us feel?" Ludmilla frowned across the corner of the war room table at Liane. Liane frowned back. Was she not allowed to worry? As she had feared, the beastmen were sending reinforcements down the Orakelon. There were so many that reconnaissance simply lost count. Based on the number of vessels, 400,000 were already assembled and more was still coming. Olga's forces north of Eastwatch were given a convenient excuse to turn away from the border and towards the city, but they were taking a tremendous beating in the process and had to slow down to allow Elder Lajmana to keep up with fog cloud deployment. The state of general panic that the Royal Army had worked so hard to cultivate had vanished, replaced by the steely discipline and fluid operations that the warrior clans had initially displayed. The newcomers moved with even more confidence than the warrior clans from before, and she couldn't imagine them being so easy to break, with the stakes being what they seemed to be. Additionally, things had become awkward. There were twice as many beastmen as she had undead. It might have still appeared to be an undead horde to the beastmen, but they would realize that they had out-horded the horde sooner or later. "They've left the southern half of the border wide open," Marshal Zulu said from his side of the table. "Would they expose their territory to invasion so easily?" "It's not as foolish as it may seem, Your Excellency," Ludmilla said. "It's not just the border that's mountains and jungles, everything past the border is. The undead would take weeks to get anywhere important, and the beastmen can defend their territories with ease." They weren't the gnolls of the blister, but she suspected that things would be just as bad from the sheer number of beastmen that could be mobilized and the vast territory that they were completely free to operate in. Shouldn't Elishnish have noticed this? Why didn't she say anything? Ludmilla glanced at Florine. "I don't see why she would. It would probably look something like a Riastais levy. From her perspective, there would be 1 or 2 people from each village she passes walking by her on the road, and these beastmen already move around quite a bit as far as I've seen. This army only starts looking like one as its members approach their mustering point, which is on our side of the border." Elishnish was out of range for telepathic communication, meaning that she was also too far to notice an overt buildup of military forces. As far as her companion went, all Ludmilla could feel was the timid bundle of stress and worry that Elishnish was whenever she was out of her element, to which she would offer a reassuring telepathic nuzzle once in a while. The beastmen used their rivers extensively, so telling everything apart would be difficult at a glance, especially for a frost dragon who would have no idea what she was looking at. Elishnish's closest comparison would be the ships sailing up and down the Katza River. If asked, she would report what the beastmen used boats for and how their infrastructure literally worked, which included ferrying people and goods around the Orakelon basin. "Is victory still possible?" Prime Minister Yorstin asked. Ludmilla wiped away her worried expression. "It might get a bit messy, Your Excellency," Ludmilla said, "but yes. I was thinking that this situation may also work in our favor." "How so?" "If we play things right, we can make things seem as if the bulk of the undead threat has been quelled. Once we finish the reconquest, we can send the remainder of the undead horde across the border to be destroyed. All that will be left will be the patrols of Death Series servitors wandering the outskirts of the ruined and undead-infested Draconic Kingdom." With less than half of their population surviving, the Draconic Kingdom would be focusing their recovery efforts in the west, far away from their borders with the Beastmen. The frontier defenses would be haunted and any Beastmen that attempted to get by them would not be allowed to return home. The human holdouts in the southern provinces would win back the Draconic Kingdom as the years passed, which would coincidentally line up with their military's adaptations to working with their new undead allies. It was a shaky narrative, at best. Florian was especially vicious when it came to pointing out all of the plot holes. Maybe she had hoped to use it for Dreams of Red. Will any of the undead horde be left after this battle? Marshal Zillow asked. If we mean to use them as you described, they can't be deployed in the same way as before because this many beastmen would quickly obliterate them. That's something we can make up for after the battle, Your Excellency. The undead horde participating in this battle will be destroyed, but the defeat of the beastmen will result in a new one. We can also bring in more dominated forces from Katza if necessary. We'll have that number diminish with each wave until the beastmen are satisfied that the immediate threat has been addressed. It's not as if the beastmen can do anything about it even if they do figure out they've been played for fools the entire time, Lian shrugged. By the time they notice, the citizens will be safely away and the border secured. They'll just have to live with the fact that they were screwed out of their conquest. Lian jerked to the side as Florian elbowed her in the ribs. It was as she said, however. Raids and migrations happened because they needed to. Either through direct need or future problems formally addressed through custom and ritual. Tribes didn't attack their neighbors and thus risk themselves simply because they felt like it. The substantial reduction in the beastmen's numbers meant that they wouldn't need to look to external sources, in other words, raid, for food. It would take them at least a generation to reach that point again. The only problem she could think of was if the slain theocracy finally decided to show up. They wouldn't be pleased to find their supposed monopoly over the Draconic Kingdom's affairs broken, and the Draconic Kingdom's reception would be cool, at best. According to Clara, the Sorceress Kingdom's benign approach to the region would be tested by friction over the Draconic Kingdom. As history would often tell, those with power and influence did not give it up without a fight. Several markers were added to the table as the Elder Liches updated the map. Each marker represented 10,000 beastmen, and their army was forming into a clear defensive array. Isn't their positioning a bit too perfect? Ludmilla said, they're arranging themselves in an exact counter to our advancing forces. Even the regiments organized along the Orichalon are positioned according to the undead moving 20 kilometers south of the river. Their physical reconnaissance shouldn't be capable of such extensive reporting. I agree, Captain, Willuvian said, but there doesn't seem to be an answer as to why it's happening. None of our squads has reported any signs of divination magic being used. The only other plausible answer is that the enemy has deployed concealed flying observers. That could have been anything from scouts with flight magic to ranger companions. Countless birds were flying around and it was practically impossible to distinguish whether any particular one was a reconnaissance asset. With so many new entries to the conflict, the potential new ideas that they may have brought with them had to be considered, except one couldn't account for every single possibility. They could also be using divination magic and simply concealing its use, Ludmilla said. We just have to work under the assumption that the visibility limitations of ground commanders that we've been exploiting don't apply here. Headquarters is of the mind that it does not matter, one of the Elder Liches at the table said. The pieces are in play and may be seen by all. It is too late to change the ultimate result. 30 infantry squads, each composed of 10 Death Knights, 2 Death Warriors, 2 Death Priests and 1 Elder Lich. 200 Elder Liches in addition to them. Most people who understood the sheer power being brought to bear would agree that the beastmen were doomed. As an officer on the field, however, she was well aware of the realities that faced them. While a human nation like the Baharuth Empire didn't have the assets to resist their current force, the beastmen most likely did. It was difficult to imagine that they didn't, considering how vast their territory appeared to be. Initial skirmishing conducted by Olga had proven that the beastman hunters could easily destroy Elder Liches. The standard abjurations that were the bane of mundane archery offered no protection on this battlefield, and the bludgeoning damage of bullets was a weakness of skeletal undead. That meant that their Elder Liches were relegated to supporting roles, primarily through summons. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, as the counterfeiters deployed in the Draconic Kingdom were built as necromancers anyway, but it did remove the option of direct fire support. Risk-free direct fire support, at least. 300 Death Knights could be tied up by 300 tribal champions, and the forces supporting those champions would make short work of squire zombies and zombies. The Beastmen also tended to be offensively oriented, putting Death Warriors at risk of being overwhelmed as had happened at Corin on the lake. The mana of 60 Death Priests was no match for the countless mystics at their opponents' disposal. It was a battle that Ludmilla would not commit to if she could help it. Letting the Beastmen go on the offensive and having them disperse across the front would be the prudent move. There were any number of things she could do to pick them apart if she was afforded the time and space to do so. I still say that a standoff is in our favor, Ludmilla said. If we secure the citizens and cut off the Beastmen's supply lines, they'll starve in no time. That is undoubtedly the case, Captain, Willuvian said, but our royal court wishes the matter of the Beastmen to be concluded as quickly as possible. Ludmilla held in a sigh. The royal court of the Sorceress Kingdom was highly results-oriented, and the Beastmen were in the way of achieving their desired results with the Draconic Kingdom. Across the table, Queen Auriculus covered her mouth in a yawn. With an appearance like hers, it was undeniably cute, but Ludmilla's gaze went past the Queen's shoulder to the entire reason the offensive was guaranteed to succeed. Once Lord Tien entered the battle, it was over for the Beastmen. It didn't matter if there were 500,000 or even 10 million, if the Beastmen stood their ground against him, they wouldn't be Beastmen for long. She didn't like the idea of sending him into battle, however. Not only did it mean that the royal army was inadequate for the task that it had been assigned, but Lord Tien was fundamentally a good man. He was the type that did not relish the prospect of a one-sided slaughter, seeing it as a waste of life rather than any sort of achievement. Like Ludmilla, duty drove him, and she knew that duty could take people to places that they didn't like. She wanted to spare him that experience, if possible. "How is the evacuation of the citizens proceeding?" Ludmilla asked. "It's barely been 3 days since we arrived in Corin on the lake," Minister Sorrel answered. "We've moved 200,000 so far. In terms of area covered, that's about 10 kilometers past the eastern end of the lake." That was another problem limiting the Royal Army's options. It wasn't so much that their bluff the undead horde had been called, but making a stand that couldn't be broken by that bluff amounted to the same thing. The only way was forward, and stepping backwards not only revealed the true nature of the undead invading the Draconic Kingdom, but also exposed the unharmed humans left in their wake. Leanne was right in that it wouldn't matter after it was all over, but it wasn't over yet, and hundreds of thousands of the Draconic Kingdom's citizens were still in harm's way. In that regard, the royal court was justified in pushing for a decisive conclusion to the conflict, as it would permanently resolve nearly all of the strategic considerations that they were juggling while maintaining their facade. "On the subject of Your Majesty attending the battle at Eastwatch," Ludmilla said, "I hope it is understood that we cannot place the sovereign of the Draconic Kingdom right on the front lines." "We understand," Queen Auriculus replied. "Being able to witness events from afar is sufficient." In that case, Ludmilla nodded and used a plotting rod to indicate a feature on the map. "This hill should offer a view of most of the battlefield. Please do not bring anything or anyone that might make your presence conspicuous." "Then we shall go there on our own. With Sabos, of course." "Why, Your Majesty?" the Prime Minister said, "this is highly irregular. So much is already at risk, and the more people there are, the more conspicuous things will be, yes? This is not some pleasant outing where one can bring a pavilion and a baggage train." "Then at least let Your Majesty's servant know. You lot have enough work to do as it is." "Will this be fine, Captain?" Ludmilla looked at Lord Tien, who nodded in return. "Yes, Your Majesty," Ludmilla said. "We'll be using a barge to deliver you to the shore near the hill, so I'm sure a chair can be provided at least. Or Lord Tien can just cradle you in his arms the entire time," Leanne said. Queen Auriculus stared blankly at Leanne for a moment, and then she went red to the tips of her ears. "Th, the chair will be fine." The Queen scurried out of the war room, trailed by Lord Tien and her courtiers. Ludmilla retired to the back of the suite containing the war room with her friends. Once the door closed behind them, Clara shot Leanne a look. "Could we not tease heads of state at formal meetings? Queen Ori, actually, what do we call her? The Draconic Kingdom isn't a kingdom, is it?" "I don't feel the need to break prevailing conventions," Florian said, "so long as we understand how things truly are." I'm not even sure if I understand that much. Leanne plopped herself into a cushioned chair. Going by how things are structured, Clara sat down at the same table. It's a polity where each race or clan governs its own. Queen Auriculus guides them as the Dragon Lord whose domain they reside in. Each race? It's only humans. Because they've been reliant on the theocracy for protection from the beastmen, Florine said. Without knowing that tidbit, they just seem like another human kingdom. Now that we do know, however, the entire way that the Draconic Kingdom is run and the relationship it has with its neighbors take on an entirely different form. Queen Auriculus goes as far as she is allowed to by the theocracy with her non-human neighbors. Now that the Sorcerer's Kingdom has come into the picture and the Draconic Kingdom is no longer chained to the theocracy's policies, it wouldn't surprise me if the Draconic Kingdom started expanding. Like, into the sea? Leanne looked out the window at the lake. It seems that way. All of their treaties with the aquatic demi-humans off the coast stop just short of being a formal alliance. Given how relations are between them, they probably already treat it as an informal one. Since the Queen claims that our form of government is the fragmented remnant of a government that imitates some ancient form of draconic government, we should at least be familiar with its components if it does come to pass. I think it might serve as a good study for our own country. We've been trying to make things work using the broken imitation government that Riastais uses, but Queen Auriculus apparently knows how the real thing operates. So we just stick His Majesty where the Queen is? Well, she did say it's a government designed for powerful immortals. I can't think of anyone who better fits the bill. We'll see, I guess, Leanne said. I wouldn't just take someone at their word over a claim like that. Queen Auriculus is probably pretty old, but she's not that old. If true, it did seem like a valuable thing to study as nobles who were responsible for overseeing territories in a multiracial society. That being said, the Sorcerer King probably had something far superior to some system refined over untold eons by Dragon Lords in mind. Speaking of old, Leanne said as she reached for the plate of cookies placed on the polished cedar table, how's that translation thingy of yours coming along, Clara? I've been working on it for an hour or two every day, Clara replied. It's mostly scattered notes that I haven't compiled yet. After applying the principles demonstrated in the local Draconic, I've discovered that a lot of things have been missed. Anything neat? Leanne popped a cookie into her mouth. It's a personal diary, but it offers a fascinating window into whomever these people were. The author is a human and conveys herself in ways that I can understand and empathize with, but, at the same time, she has an almost inhuman perspective of the world. Leanne stared at Clara while chewing slowly on her treat. I'm not sure if there's any concise way to put it, Clara said. Integrated, or maybe fused is a better word. We've been fixated on the government portion of the Draconic Kingdom, but Lady Austin said that their country is one that is meant to be a part of the world. In the life of Elena Gran, we can see what that's truly like. The human-centric perspective that we possess is nearly absent in hers. In its place is the culture of a society that embraces the diversity of its members. One that doesn't attempt to homogenize everything into a single set of norms. They understand that individuals can only be what they are, so their efforts are focused on cultivating a highly advanced degree of appreciation for the world and all of its peoples. That sounds like an absolute mess, Leanne said. It would, from our perspective, Clara nodded. But this wasn't something that was achieved in years or even decades. It's a complex system that originates in an epoch that we have absolutely no knowledge of. Elena Gran's journal is possibly the greatest treasure uncovered in our history. Even as a diary, it contains proven concepts that would never cross our minds in the present day. In doing so, it also points out many dangerous things that we would similarly never consider. Like what? Clara leaned forward on her side of the couch, cradling a warm cup of tea in her hands. The way that the world translates verbal communication, for instance. Most people would consider that a convenience, Leanne said. It facilitates communication between people. That's helpful. It can be, Clara said, but consider how it works. We all know multiple languages, so we should all understand the difference between this translation mechanism and true comprehension of language. Leanne looked up at the ceiling as if counting off points in her head. Songs and literature don't get translated, literary device also doesn't. Turns of phrase don't work, neither does layered communication. Relevance of what is being said is hit and miss. I guess you could say that things are being translated in a purely literal sense. That last part is actually wrong, Clara said. It is? Leanne frowned. Oh, I get it. Florine straightened in her seat. You do? Leanne's frown deepened. That's very dangerous. Florine covered her mouth with her hand in a thoughtful gesture. One could say that it's very nearly insidious. The more likely one is to recognize the issue, the fewer indications manifest to inform them of it. Leanne looked at Ludmilla. Do you get it? She asked. No, Ludmilla answered. I think we all do, subconsciously, Clara said. That's why we tend to expound on things if we feel the need to. Our understanding of language makes us aware of the misunderstandings that can take place, so we endeavor to make sure that what is heard by the other party is correctly understood. Also, as nobles, we are accustomed to directing others and making sure our policies and directives are carried out as we mean them to be. The world's translation mechanism is reliant on the recipient's understanding, Florine said. It conveys the closest available thing that the listener understands, and what is conveyed is absent of all of the things that Leanne listed. We consider people that only hear what they want to hear a problem, but this problem is orders of magnitude worse. It's a whole world of people that only hear what they can understand. It essentially entrenches different groups into their respective worldviews, and the fact that the only comprehensive communication generally occurs within a group encourages divisive or even antagonistic attitudes toward other groups. But it's still better than not being able to understand others at all, right? Leanne said. It may seem that way, Florine replied, but it's a gift that comes with all sorts of traps. Queen Auricula's example with the Draconic Kingdom is highly instructive. Even one's contextual positioning influences translation to the point where the benign may be taken as malignant and vice versa. Imagine a scenario where this translation thing doesn't exist. If one meets someone they don't understand, they are eminently aware of it. If communication is desired, one makes the effort to understand what the other party is saying and they are aware that misunderstandings or misinterpretations may occur. With this translation mechanism, most will tend to take everything they hear at face value. There is no effort put into understanding, no investigation of language, culture, history, physical cues, or anything else that will result in a comprehensive working knowledge of the other party and the full meaning of what they say. That effort is a pain in the ass that most people wouldn't have time for, Leanne noted. Which is why the Pandraconic that the Draconic Kingdom uses and High Imperial in Elena Grant's journal are so awe-inspiring, Clara said. At first, I wondered why anyone would go to the trouble of coming up with High Imperial and that it would naturally develop into the different languages that the region uses today without its use being arbitrarily enforced. In reality, what the region speaks isn't development at all, it's devolution. High Imperial is superior to the world's translation mechanisms for the myriad of races that used it, and it is merely one component of a highly advanced cooperative that was destroyed for reasons unknown. I dunno, Leanne said, they had to have had their share of problems, as well. I'm sure that they did, Clara said, but this is a personal diary and I doubt that anything beyond the scope of Elena Grant's life would be included. As far as I can tell, she was just one of many arcanists who helped maintain the Imperial Archive of Lagers. Her thoughts are more focused on the young man who keeps visiting her at work than anything else. Florine seemed to perk up at the possibility of romance. When do we get to read it? She asked. When I'm satisfied that the translation has been done properly, Clara answered. So what did we get out of this, anyway? Leanne said, that people only hear what they understand and the world sucks because of it? That beating people up to establish a dialogue is more efficient than I thought it was, Ludmilla said. Leanne maneuvered herself behind Florine. How do you figure? It just works. Almost everyone that I've beaten up is 100% satisfied with their current situation. Or dead. Either way, I cannot honestly say that civil diplomacy does any better. She's probably onto something, Florine said. What we consider valid diplomacy may not be viewed the same way by other races and vice versa. Some may be more adept at certain forms of diplomacy than others. Conflict, for instance, exposes many truths that are immediately understood by all parties involved, truths that diplomats often do their best to obscure or deflect attention away from. Sometimes, complete fabrications gain ground. Consider it in terms of the class system, Clara nodded. Every race has things that they are naturally inclined toward. Unless one's race is naturally inclined toward what we recognize as proper diplomacy, they won't value it as much as we do. Humans will always try to base any competition or negotiation on vocational fields because humanoid races do not have racial class levels. All else being equal, a human will tend to have the advantage over a demi-human in vocational arenas because they'll tend to have more of the relevant job class levels. People may not be aware of the system, Florine added, but they're not stupid. They know what their advantages and disadvantages are. Humans decrying the lack of diplomacy and the approach of their demi-human neighbors may be viewed as humans simply trying to arrange things in their favor. A human country sending a civilian noble to conduct civil diplomacy with a troll that has lived in a wild forest for all of its life is about as fair to the troll as an unarmed duel against the troll is to the human. There's simply no contest. Wait, is that what you did in Top? Leanne asked. I thought you were just boobing them. In part, Florine answered, then frowned. Stop calling it boobing. I used my abilities against them only so far as to make it understood that I was on the same side of the table as they were. That I was an official working on behalf of valued citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom, not the representative of a foreign party trying to get something for my side. Regular human diplomacy has multiple parties set against one another trying to achieve diplomacy goals that are usually whatever they think they can get away with. Things like mutually beneficial agreements or satisfactory terms can only happen when both sides hold equal footing or the side with the advantage purposely settles for less than what they could potentially get. Usually for some greater objective, which is pretty much what we were supposed to be doing in the Draconic Kingdom. Well, say what you're saying holds true, Leanne said. That's a problem for us, isn't it? We're born and bred to do this stuff. If the Sorceress Kingdom can't ruthlessly fling their superior human diplomats and whatever else at non-human countries, what do we do? More advanced countries should have official protocols for that sort of thing, Clara said. As for everyone else, we'll just have to find common ground. It's not as if the vocational academies in Tallinn Harbor are only open to humans, Florine said. If we encounter a troll country, we could just send a delegation of troll diplomats. Troll diplomats. Ludmilla tried to imagine a troll amidst a class mostly attended by noble scions. Clara, she said, you're going to need bigger desks. Is that the first thing that comes to mind? Clara said, putting together a curriculum that satisfies both Miss Alpha and Lady Albedo is hard enough when it's just humans. Then I suppose we're back to beating people up to establish a dialogue, Ludmilla said. Honestly, I'm almost certain that neither of them would be opposed to that, Clara sighed. Aren't they sort of like the opposite of one another? Leanne said. Not when it comes to this, Clara replied. Despite everything else about her, Miss Alpha is the sort to hit things and think about the consequences later. I was wondering what made that hole in the wall of the orphanage classroom, Florine said. It's a hole now? A furrow creased Clara's brow. On that note, Ludmilla rose to her feet. I must go and deliver some violent consequences of my own. Make sure Leanne doesn't try to sneak onto the Queen's barge. It's my barge, thank you very much. And we're already too close to any sort of war zone for my comfort. Clara rose from her side of the couch, coming over to wrap Ludmilla up in a tight embrace. I, for one, am glad this is nearly over, Clara said. We hardly get any time together anymore. Fight well, Ludmilla.